There are moments in a life when everything you thought you knew falls quiet. When the noise of who you are and what you want stops mattering entirely. When the shape of the future you had been building in your mind dissolves and what remains is something older, something stripped down to its most essential form. In those moments, there is no ambition. There is no regret. There is only the question, simple and brutal and undecorated, standing in front of you like a wall you did not see coming. Will you make it through this or not? This is a story about one of those moments. And it is not, in the end, the story of a man who survived the desert. It is the story of a horse that chose to save him. And the longer you stay with it, the more you begin to wonder which of them was really the one who was lost. His name was Calloway. Nobody called him by his first name anymore, not since his father died and the ranch passed into other hands and the life he had drawn out for himself in his mind since boyhood dissolved quietly, gradually, the way ink dissolves in rain. Not all at once. Slowly. A line here, a border there, until the whole map was illegible and he was standing in a landscape he no longer recognized as his own. He was 34 years old, and he had spent the last 8 of those years drifting between work, breaking horses for ranchers who paid what they felt like paying, guiding supply runs through terrain that most men avoided not because they couldn't manage it but because they found the silence out there unsettling. Living light. Living alone. Not because he wanted solitude exactly, but because that had become the shape of his life and he had long since stopped fighting the shape. He had learned, in those 8 years, to move through the world the way water moves through a dry season. Finding whatever channel was available. Taking the form of whatever container he was given. Not complaining about the container. There was a kind of freedom in it, he told himself. And there was. But there was also something else. Something he didn't name for a long time. A weight that had nothing to do with what he carried on his back. The men who left him were not strangers. That was the part that would stay with him long after everything else faded, long after the details of the crossing blurred and the particulars of his near-death dissolved into the general territory of bad memories. They were men he had eaten beside. Men he had shared fires with through cold nights and terrain that discouraged conversation and somehow produced it anyway. Men whose voices he knew in the dark. 3 weeks of close proximity in difficult country does something to the space between people. It either builds trust or it exposes the absence of it. Cole Reardon had hired him in a town called Garfield's Creek, which was not so much a town as a collection of structures arranged around the water source and a grudging acknowledgement that people needed somewhere to stop. Reardon was a compact man with an economy of movement that Calloway had read, at first, as confidence. He spoke in short declarative sentences. He did not waste gestures. He had a way of looking at you that suggested he had already considered you carefully and formed a conclusion, and the conclusion was, at best, provisional. Calloway had met men like him before. They were often useful to work for because they were efficient and they didn't ask more than they needed to. They were sometimes dangerous to trust for the same reason. The job was a crossing through the Sonora Basin. A route Calloway had done twice before, once for a mining outfit and once guiding a small herd of cattle that had no business being driven through that terrain but whose owner had no patience for the longer route. He knew the landmarks. He knew the water sources and the gaps between them. He knew where the ground could be trusted and where it looked trustworthy and wasn't. The pay Reardon was offering was decent without being generous, which was exactly the kind of pay Calloway had learned to accept without asking too many questions. The party was 5 men including himself. Reardon. A heavy-set man named Galt who spoke rarely and sweated constantly and who Calloway could not entirely read. 2 others whose names he was given but who felt interchangeable in the way that men sometimes do when they are clearly extensions of someone else's will rather than persons in their own right. They had supplies for 12 days. The crossing, done properly, took 8. There was room for error, which was exactly how Calloway liked to plan. For the first 12 days, the work had been what it was supposed to be. Early starts before the heat built. Careful pacing. Reading the ground ahead before committing to it. Reardon was not an easy man to lead because he was accustomed to being the one making decisions, and there were moments of friction at the margins, small disagreements about route and timing that Calloway let pass without escalating because the difference between being right and being useful was something he understood. The work was harder than it needed to be because of that friction, but it got done. Then the mood shifted. It started with small things, as it always does when something larger is building beneath the surface. A silence that stretched too long after certain conversations. Eyes that moved away when they should have met his. A quality of listening that felt less like attention and more like calculation. He noticed it the way you notice weather before it arrives, not as a visible sign but as a change in pressure, in the texture of the air. Something tightening. He told himself he was imagining it. He was not imagining it. He began to pay attention in different ways. He watched where the other men's eyes went when they thought he wasn't watching. He noted the small adjustments they made when he approached a conversation already in progress. He cataloged the way Reardon had started to look at him across the fire at night, a look that was not hostile exactly but that had a quality of assessment in it that hadn't been there before. Like a man measuring a distance he was about to cross. On the 16th day, he woke at dawn to find the camp already half broken down. 2 of the 4 horses were gone. The supply packs had been redistributed with a thoroughness that suggested prior planning. The fire was long cold. And Cole Reardon was standing at the edge of where the fire had been, thumbs in his belt, watching Calloway the way you watch something you have already decided to leave behind. Galt was beside him. The 2 others were somewhere at the edge of the camp, not quite within easy earshot. Calloway lay still for a moment, not because he needed more time to understand what was happening, but because there's a particular kind of clarity that comes when you let understanding arrive at its own pace. He looked at the camp. He looked at the 2 horses still tied where the others had been. He looked at the sky, which was the pale gray-blue of early morning with a faint orange seam at the eastern horizon. He breathed once, slowly, and then he sat up and looked at Reardon. There were no threats. There were no explanations that bothered with causes. Just Cole's voice, flat and unhurried, the way a man speaks when he has rehearsed what he intends to say and no longer feels anything about it. He said the arrangement was ending here. That Calloway services were no longer needed. That he'd leave him with the old gray horse in one canteen, which was more than some men got, and that he could call it square. Calloway sat on his bedroll and looked at Reardon for a long time. He looked at the set of the man's shoulders. He looked at the careful stillness of Galt beside him and the position of the other 2 men at the edge of the camp, bodies angled in a way that was not casual. He understood the geometry of the situation. He understood it fully, and he felt, underneath the understanding, something that was not quite fear and not quite anger and was perhaps closest to a kind of grief. Not for himself. Or not only for himself. For the particular stupidity of men who made decisions like this one. For the waste of it. The horse was standing tied to the remaining post, watching him. Old and gray and rough-coated and underfed looking, with the particular stillness of an animal that has learned to conserve what it has. It was not the horse Calloway had been riding for the crossing. That was one of the ones that had already been taken. This was something Reardon had sourced cheaply and probably didn't care much about losing. Calloway stood up slowly. He didn't speak for a long time. He looked at the desert stretching out in every direction like a sentence with no end, like a question that refuses to resolve. He measured what he had. 1 canteen. A knife on his belt. The rope coiled on the post beside the gray. Whatever was in his coat pockets, which was not much. He thought about the water sources on the route he'd planned and where they fell in relation to where he was now. He thought about the distance to the nearest settlement. He thought about the heat that was coming as the morning advanced. Then he looked at Cole Reardon and asked, quietly, if Cole understood what he was doing. Cole told him he did. And then they rode away. The sound of it was the worst part. Not the sight, not the distance growing between his position and theirs, but the sound of hooves on dry earth growing fainter and fainter, for sets and then 3 sets and then nothing. The silence closing back over it completely, the way water closes over a stone. And then there was only wind. And the sound of the gray breathing. Calloway stood in that silence for a long moment. He had been left before. He had been cheated before. He had been in difficult terrain before with inadequate resources. None of those experiences were foreign to him. But there's a particular quality to being left alone in the Sonora Basin at dawn with a half-empty canteen and a horse that looks like it has already lived most of its life, and that quality has nothing to do with statistics or probabilities. It has to do with something older. Something the body understands before the mind catches up. Something that says, this is serious. He walked to the gray and stood beside it and looked at it carefully. Not the way you look at a horse when you're deciding whether to buy it. The way you look at something when you're deciding whether you can rely on it. Those are very different examinations. The gray was older than he had first thought when he'd seen it tied at the edge of camp over the past days, half obscured by the other animals. Up close, its coat had the particular roughness of an animal that had been worked hard through many seasons and rested poorly between them. Its ribs were visible, but not alarmingly so. The kind of visible that says lean, not the kind that says failing. One of its rear hooves had been trimmed unevenly at its last shoeing, giving it a slight compensatory shift in its stance on uneven ground. Its eyes were clear. That was the first thing Calloway looked at in any horse. Clear eyes meant the animal was present. Present meant there was something to work with. It stood very still while he examined it. Ears half-laid. Breathing in slow, measured draws. Not nervous. Not defeated. Waiting, in the particular way of a patient animal, for whatever was going to happen next. Calloway had worked with horses his whole life, from the time he was big enough to stand beside one without flinching. He had worked with horses that had been broken badly and horses that had been broken well and horses that seemed, in some fundamental way, never to have been fully broken at all, that retained something private and inviolable beneath whatever compliance you had trained into them. He knew the difference between a horse that had given up and a horse that was simply resting between efforts. He studied the gray for a long moment. It was waiting. He was nearly sure of it. He named it nothing. He would tell people that later, when there were people to tell. He would say he didn't give it a name because naming things made losing them harder, and he had already accumulated enough losses that he'd stopped adding to the weight voluntarily. But the truth, which he kept quieter and examined only late at night when the day's other concerns had settled, was something different. He felt something in the gray that he didn't want to define too early. Something that required observation. Something that required time and distance to understand properly. You name what you know. What you are still learning you leave unnamed until the learning is finished. He checked the canteen. He shook it, listened, estimated. Perhaps enough for 12 hours if he was careful. Perhaps less, if the heat was as bad as the sky was already promising. The nearest settlement he knew of was roughly 40 miles northwest, across country that offered little shade and worse footing as you moved deeper into the basin's heart. He had no food. He had the knife, the rope, and whatever judgment remained in him after 16 days of difficult work in a morning that had just dismantled whatever composure he'd built up. It was not a generous inventory. He looked at it honestly and didn't pretend it was better than it was. Then he picked up the canteen, took one small measured sip, and mounted the gray. The gray stood patient and steady while he settled his weight. Didn't shift. Didn't test him. just absorbed the addition and stood there in the growing morning heat with the same quality of readiness that had been there from the beginning, as if it had been waiting for exactly this. Calloway pointed them northwest and they began. In the first 2 hours, he kept them to the flattest ground he could find. The Sonora Basin at its margins was deceptive in ways that rewarded attention and punished assumption. What looked like open, even terrain from 50 yards was often fractured stone just beneath a thin skim of dust, the kind of surface that would give under a horse's weight if the hooves landed in the wrong configuration. He kept the pace deliberate. A walk, nothing faster. He watched the ground ahead in a zone roughly 30 feet in front of them, reading the color and texture for signs of what lay beneath. He talked to the gray as they moved, not words exactly, not in the way you talk to a person. Just sound. The kind of low, continuous, rhythmic murmur that horses settle into, a sound they can match their breathing to. He had done it his whole life. His father had done it before him. It was not affection, or not primarily. It was technique. It kept the animal calibrated to his presence. It kept both of them in the same rhythm. He thought about water as they moved. It was necessary to think about it constantly, not obsessively but as a continuous background calculation, the way a navigator thinks about fuel. He knew one reliable source, a seep at the base of a rock formation he called the Twins, 2 columns of pale sandstone that were visible from a long way off and that he had used as a landmark on both of his previous crossings. He estimated them at perhaps 15 miles out. If the gray could hold this pace through the morning heat, they could reach the Twins by early afternoon. Drink. Rest in the shade. Reassess. That was the plan. It was a reasonable plan. It relied on things he thought he could count on. That was the first assumption he needed to let go of. Somewhere in the 3rd hour, the gray did something that made him stop. They had been picking a route he had chosen himself, a long diagonal heading toward a low ridge he recognized as a reliable reference point, when the gray slowed. Not stumbled. Not balked. Not the hesitation of a tired or reluctant animal. Slowed deliberately, and then turned, just slightly, perhaps 3 or 4 degrees east of the line Calloway was holding. The turn was not dramatic. It was the turn of a horse expressing a preference. Small but unmistakable if you were paying attention. Calloway corrected it. Gentle but clear. A slight shift of weight in a light touch on the rein. Northwest was northwest. He knew this ground. Or he had known it before. He trusted his bearings. The gray accepted the correction and walked on. It did not resist. It came back to the line he had set and held it. For perhaps a quarter of a mile, there was no repetition. The ground was flat and pale under the rising sun, and the only sound was wind and hooves on dry earth and the faint creak of the saddle. And then it happened again. On perfectly open ground, with nothing visible ahead for a mile in every direction, the gray drifted east again. The same gentle, deliberate turn. Not random. Not the drift of a tired animal losing its line. It was the same number of degrees. The same direction. The same quality of intention in it. Calloway sat still on the gray's back and looked east. There was a slight elevation in the terrain in that direction, a shallow rise that might mean nothing. The soil looked different there, possibly, a shade lighter perhaps, but that could be the angle of the light. He looked northwest again, toward his intended line. The way he knew. He corrected the gray again, and this time he held the rein for longer. Held it firmly. Northwest. The gray complied. The gray walked north of west, exactly as directed. And Calloway watched the ground ahead and felt, for the first time, a thin thread of uncertainty working through him. Not enough to change course, but enough to notice. 23 minutes later, the ground collapsed. Not catastrophically, not a sudden drop into nothing. A section of crust, perhaps 4 feet across, gave way beneath the gray's front left hoof with a sound like something exhaling. The hollow beneath it was not deep, perhaps 2 feet, but the shock of the hoof breaking through and then hanging in the air caused the gray to lurch forward and then backward in fast, powerful sequence. It scrambled. It got its legs under itself. It pulled back from the edge of the opening and stood on solid ground with its front legs shaking slightly and its breath coming short and fast. Calloway had been thrown forward onto the gray's neck and came back upright hard, one hand wound in mane, the other on the horn, his seat recovered by reflex rather than intention. He sat there for a long time without moving. The opening in the ground was perhaps 2 feet wide now where the crust had collapsed. He could see, looking at it from the gray's back, that the hollow extended under the surface in a long diagonal line running roughly north-northwest. A wind cave. He knew what they were. He had heard about them, had seen their entrances at the edges of formations where the basin floor rose to meet exposed rock. But he had never encountered one beneath open ground before, never felt one give under him, and the knowledge that he had been walking toward this for the last 20 minutes while the horse had been quietly, persistently trying to steer him around it moved through him in a way that took a moment to fully arrive. He looked at the line of the hollow as it extended beneath the surface, marked now by a slight depression in the crust above it, the depression he had not seen from a distance, that was invisible at any angle except directly overhead, that no person walking or riding at pace would have noticed. The section of ground that it held above it looked identical to everything around it. The same pale dust, the same dry crust, the same nothing to indicate what was beneath. There was no way to read it from a distance. There was no way to read it at all unless you had walked this specific terrain through every season for years and knew where these formations opened and where they ran. Unless you could feel them from below through the vibration of your own passage across them. Unless you had, in the soles of your feet or the weight of your hooves, a sensitivity to the hollow resonance that open ground does not produce. Unless you were the gray. Calloway sat with this for a long time. He sat with the reality of it, which was that the horse had known before he could know, had tried twice to tell him and had been overridden twice, had then, when the ground proved the horse right in the most direct possible way, done nothing except regain its footing and stand steady, waiting again. The gray turned its head and looked back at him with one large, dark eye. Its breathing was returning to normal. Its legs had stopped shaking. It had the expression of an animal that had made its case and was prepared, now that the case had been received, to continue. Calloway let the reins go slack in his hands for a moment. He sat in the building heat with the desert around him and the collapsed ground in front of him and the long invisible hollow running under the surface like a sentence beneath the obvious one, and he felt something shift in his chest. Not dramatically. Quietly. The way a weight shifts when you redistribute it properly and suddenly the load is easier to carry. He shortened the left rein and turned them east. The gray moved without hesitation or ceremony. No acknowledgement of having been correct. No change in its pace or posture. Just the immediate, willing response of an animal that had been waiting patiently for the conversation to reach this point and was now ready to continue. The route east was different from the route northwest. It climbed almost immediately onto slightly higher ground, a shallow ridge that the basin's flatness had made invisible from below. From the top of that ridge, perhaps 2 miles along, Calloway could see the hollow's line continuing ahead to the northwest, the depression in the surface above it just barely visible in the low angle of the morning light, like a scar that had healed almost completely but not quite. He would have walked straight into it. There was no version of that which ended differently than it would have ended. He did not push the pace. He let the gray find its own line across the new terrain, which it did with the same careful deliberateness it had shown from the beginning, choosing the firmer footing, skirting the looser ground, moving in a way that suggested not so much navigation as knowledge. the territory inside the animal. The routes learned and kept. The hours after that had a different quality. Not easier in the physical sense. The heat was worse as the day peaked, pressing down in waves that made the horizon swim and turn the middle distance into something uncertain. Heat at its worst in the Sonora Basin does not simply warm you. It presses. It has a directional force. It pushes down on the tops of your shoulders and the crown of your head and makes the act of holding yourself upright feel like a negotiation. Calloway rationed the water carefully, taking sips small enough that each one felt inadequate, which was how you knew you were doing it right. He kept his hat brim low. He kept his eyes on a fixed point ahead and moved toward it, and then found a new fixed point. Navigation by attention. Survival by increments. He thought about his father while they walked. He had not thought about his father in a long time, not directly, not as a presence rather than an absence. His father had been the kind of man who spoke to horses more than he spoke to people, not because he disliked people but because he found horses more straightforward. They did not dissemble. They did not perform. What they showed you is what they were. He had been teaching Calloway the same honesty from a very young age, the project of reading an animal without projecting onto it, without mistaking your wishes for its intentions. Calloway had thought he had learned that lesson well. He was not sure anymore. The gray walked on. The route it was choosing was not the most direct one. It curved. It climbed when the flat ground was available and seemed to prefer the slight ridgelines that ran parallel to the basin floor, as if it were keeping itself in a position from which it could see ahead into both sides. It descended into the shallow arroyos that carved through the lower terrain and moved along them for a stretch before climbing back out, staying in their shade for as long as the direction permitted. This was not efficiency. This was something else. This was the movement of an animal that knew this ground not as an abstraction but as a body of knowledge accumulated through passage, through season, through the accumulated memory of feet on specific earth. Calloway began to let the reins lie loose in his hands. He kept his hands available. He kept his attention engaged. But he stopped guiding and started following, and the shift between those two things was larger than the physical difference between them suggested. By mid-afternoon, the canteen was nearly empty. He shook it and the sound it made told him he had perhaps 3 mouthfuls left. He kept them for later, for the moment when he would need them most rather than the moment when he merely wanted them. He had been in bad shape in the desert before, not like this but in the general category of this, and he knew that the mind's want and the body's need were not always the same request, and confusing them was one of the ways things went wrong. The heat began to do what it does. His thoughts started to lose their edges. Events from the previous week surfaced and dissolved without him choosing to think about them. Cole Reardon's voice in the gray morning, flat and already finished. The fire going cold before he'd woken. Galt's stillness. The particular angle of the other 2 men. He turned these images over without attaching much to them. They would matter later. They would matter when later became a thing he could reach. He had a memory of a summer when he was perhaps 10 years old. He and his father had been out looking for a horse that had gotten through a fence in the night. It was late summer and the pasture land gave way, at the back edge of the property, to rough country that was not quite desert but carried the desert's patience. They had been looking for 3 hours and the heat was building and his father had stopped speaking, which was what his father did when he was most focused. Not coldly. Not forbiddingly. Just quietly, the way a man goes quiet when he is listening to something the words would interrupt. They had found the horse standing in a shallow creek bed that Calloway had not known was there. His father had never mentioned it. When Calloway asked how his father had known to look there, his father had said he hadn't. He had been following the other horse. The one they were riding, an old bay that knew the property the way water knows the land it runs through. His father had dropped the reins 2 miles back and let the bay go where it wanted. Calloway had asked why the horse knew where the other horse would go. His father had said something that had stayed with him, that had lived in him quietly for 24 years without him quite knowing what to do with it. He had said that horses knew each other the way they knew the land, not through thinking but through something older, something the thinking sat on top of. He said that if you were ever in trouble in open country and you had a horse beneath you that had been anywhere near that country before, you should trust the horse before you trusted yourself. Because yourself was young. And the horse carried something that had been finding its way home since before either of you was born. Calloway had not thought about that conversation in years. He was thinking about it now, in the blurring afternoon heat, on the back of the gray, watching the ears move and the head bob in the rhythm of a walk, feeling the steady 4-beat percussion of hooves on dry earth. The light changed when the sun dropped from its peak. The shadows stretched east and the quality of the heat shifted from vertical to angular, coming in from the side rather than straight down, still brutal but no longer oppressive in the same way. Calloway drank the last of the water. He poured the final few drops on the back of his neck and felt them evaporate before they could cool him. He put the empty canteen back on his belt because even empty it was a habit, a weight in the right place. The gray walked on. There was a period in the late afternoon when Calloway lost time. Not in the way of sleep. In the way of a mind that has been working under too much load for too long and begins to simplify itself. He was conscious. He was present in some sense of the word. He could feel the horse beneath him. He could see the ground moving past. But the self that was normally watching all of this from behind his eyes had stepped back, or stepped sideways, or simply become quieter than usual, and what remained in its place was something less complicated. Something that only felt and did not narrate. He had his hand on the gray's neck during part of this time. He was aware of the warmth of the hide under his palm, the deep pulse of the muscle working beneath it, the slow thick throb of a heart that had been beating steadily for many more years than most hearts in this work got to beat. He kept his hand there and it became an anchor. Something that told him where he was without requiring him to know where he was going. He thought about the night ahead. Desert nights in this part of the basin were cold in a way that surprised people who had only experienced the days. The same geography that amplified the heat of the sun amplified the cold of the sky when the sun was gone. He had no blanket. He had a coat, which was something. If they reached shelter before full dark, the cold would be a discomfort. If they were still out in the open when the temperature dropped seriously, the cold would be a problem. He filed this away and didn't think about it more than necessary. One thing at a time. Moving was the one thing. Keep moving. If you're still here with this story, still carried by the silence of it, then perhaps you already understand what it means to hold on to something when the rest of the world has gone quiet. You can stay as long as you like. And if this is the kind of storytelling you come back for, a like or a quiet word in the comments means more than you might think. The night came on fully. The gray walked through the dark without hesitation, its ears pricked forward, pointing at something Calloway could not see. He kept his hand on the horse's neck. He counted his breaths. And then, after a time he would never be able to measure, lights appeared at the horizon. Warm and still and real. He watched them grow and said nothing. The gray walked toward them the way it had walked all day. It carried me home. He stayed at the fence until the cold became serious and he had no more choice. Then he went inside and started the fire and put the water on and sat at the table in the warmth that built slowly and looked at his hands on the wood. Hands that had held those reins. Hands that had corrected, twice, an animal that knew better. Hands that had finally, late and almost too late, let go. He was not a sentimental man by nature or by choice. He had lived too close to the practical for too long to give sentiment much room. But he thought that morning about what it meant to be carried by something. Really carried. Not assisted. Not accompanied. Carried. The way the gray had carried him, past his own knowledge and past his own failure of trust and past the collapsed ground and through the dark and into the light that was waiting at the edge of the world when everything else had been used up. He thought, there is a road the eye cannot always see. There is a path that something older than us knows the way along. We are carried more often than we understand. Through the collapsed ground and through the dark and through the places where our own certainty has run out. By things that don't announce themselves. That don't need thanks. That don't need understanding. That only need, in the end, for us to finally let the reins go. The gray had known. From the beginning, it had known. And it had waited, with more patience than anything he had ever encountered in a human being, for him to arrive at the same knowledge. He sat at the table in the growing warmth of a fire and thought that this was, in the end, the story of his life. Not the desert. Not the leaving. Not the long drift between one place and the next. But this. The moment the horse turned east and he followed. The moment he stopped navigating and started trusting. The moment the lights appear on the horizon of a dark he had not been sure he would cross, in the hand on the warm neck, in the pulse, steady and absolute beneath it. That was the story. The rest was only the country you passed through to get there. If this story stayed with you tonight, if it settled somewhere quiet and stayed, you can leave a like below, or share a thought in the comments. And if you would like to return to stories like this, slow and cinematic, told in the cadence of a fire burning down to coals, you are always welcome to subscribe. We will always have another story waiting, whenever you are ready to hear one.